COVID-19 continues to devastate the world. Globally, there are over 68 million confirmed cases and 1.5 million deaths. In the U.S., we have marked the deadliest week since the beginning of the pandemic, with over 15 million cases and 288,000 deaths. Roughly 92 deaths are being reported every hour. Good evening, everyone, on this Wednesday, December 9th, 7 p.m. here on the East Coast. I'm Laverne McGee.
And I'm Fred Hickman. We want to immediately turn our attention to Washington, D.C., where our White House correspondent Ariana Manise has some breaking news to report. Ariana.
Good evening. The Federal Trade Commission is suing Facebook in an attempt to push the company to sell off its large assets like Instagram and WhatsApp. Now, this comes just on the heels of President Trump threatening to veto the Defense Authorization Act if provisions for big tech were not removed. We're also learning that President-elect's son Hunter Biden's taxes are under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware. We will report on more details as they emerge on this case.
Ariana, COVID relief is on everybody's mind here in America, around the world, in fact. But what will the people get is still undetermined as far as relief is concerned. What are the options the lawmakers are weighing right now?
Yeah, so there are several COVID relief packages floating around the Beltway, but only a few has the support it needs from these key players to get results. Mitch McConnell has admitted that he wants to get a deal done with House Democrats on the details both parties agree on, and they will flesh out the finer details next year. Take a listen.
So, what's the way forward? We know the new administration is going to be asking for another package. What I recommend is we set aside liability and set aside state and local and pass those things that we can agree on, knowing full well we'll be back at this after the first of the year.
But for some Democrats like Senator Bernie Sanders, the absence of a $1,200 direct deposit with an additional $500 for children fails to meet the economic crisis in American households.
And also, what's going on with the bipartisan bill, which is backed by both the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer?
It's likely that bipartisan talks will cease by December 18th. That's because lawmakers, they're looking at that date to travel to their home districts for the holidays. That does not mean a deal will be reached by the 18th. As of now, there is no legislative text on record for the bipartisan deal, but we do know that lawmakers are a step closer to putting off a shutdown. The House, they've passed a stopgap. Now we're just waiting for the Senate to do the same, which will reset the clock on government funding. Reporting live from Washington, I'm Ariana Manise for BNC. Back to you.
All right, thanks, Ariana. A quick question for you now. Would you get the vaccine if it was offered to you? A large number of polled firefighters in New York City say they would not get the vaccine if offered by the department. BNC's Ashley Leotis has the story from Manhattan.
Will you get the COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer when the department makes it available? Yes or no? That was the question asked to thousands of FDNY firefighters in a recent poll that closed on December 5th. Nearly 55% of firefighters who answered the poll said no, they would not. Over 2,000 firefighters responded to the poll. That's about 25% of the department's members, according to UFA Union President Andrew Ansbro. The union only represents firefighters and not EMS personnel or officers. Research shows firefighters are 15 times more likely to be infected than other residents in New York City. Since March, 11 FDNY members have died from COVID-19. When it comes to the poll, education could be partly to blame for the high percentage.
Because of our interaction over these past 9 months, a third of our membership, firefighters, EMTs, and paramedics, more than 5,000 of us, have had COVID. So many folks believe that having COVID, having the antibodies, they don't need the vaccine. But we have to follow the science, and the science tells us even if you've had COVID, you should take the vaccine. So we'll try to educate our folks as best we can. The union is partners with us on this, And I think that number will go up, especially as members see that there are not serious side effects and realize that taking this vaccine is wise.
Earlier this week, the fire department sent this to firefighters and EMS workers, giving facts on the vaccine. The department says it will offer the vaccine to everyone that is interested in wanting to take it. Reporting from New York City, I'm Ashley Leotis for BNC.
And all of this brings up another issue for us to think about. Can you be fired if your employer makes getting a vaccine mandatory and you refuse? Our legal correspondent, Dr. Laura McNeil, has the legal answer for us. Of course, Doctor, welcome. And can employers require employees to take this vaccination as a condition of employment? And can they be fired if they refuse?
Well, Fred, I want to say before I answer that question, don't shoot the messenger. Unfortunately, for a lot of employees, the answer is yes. Employers can mandate or require you to take the COVID-19 vaccine or lose your job. And this is not something that's out of the norm in the legal field. For years, medical hospitals have required their personnel to receive this vaccine in order to work. And so this is, again, not a new area of law, but definitely unsettling for some individuals like those New York firefighters that were just featured who don't plan on taking the vaccine. They might indeed lose their job.
Well, explain for us lay folks the legal rationale for allowing employees to be forced to take a COVID-19 vaccine or any vaccine at all.
Well, essentially, it's a health and safety work rule. And so the concept behind this is you want employers to be able to ensure that the workplace, to the greatest extent possible, is safe. It's safe for both the employees as well as their peers. And so, again, like I said, we've seen this in hospitals. And it's important to note that COVID-19 experts are saying that in order to achieve herd immunity, at least 70% of the population has to actually receive the vaccine, or they have to have natural antibodies. And so it's not going to be a surprise to me if employers help facilitate that process due to some concerns with people about not being willing to take this vaccine by mandating it. And one last thing that's important to mention, Fred, is that, employers, as you know, have really struggled during this pandemic. So mandating a vaccine could really be a game changer. If you're a restaurant and you're able to say all of our employees have been vaccinated, you won't be at risk of COVID-19 by dining here, it can really impact those businesses' profits.
And as always, I'm going to ask you about exceptions to the rule. What are the exceptions which might allow employees not to be forced to take a COVID-19 vaccine if there are any?
One thing I love about the law, there's always exceptions, and that's no different here. So essentially, there's two exceptions. So employees can say, you know what, we want to be exempted from this mandatory vaccine policy. They can have an exception based on religious beliefs. This is against my religion. And the second one is a medical accommodation. They would have to provide medical documentation on why taking this vaccine might be risky to their health. Now, another interesting exemption is if you happen to work somewhere with the union. If there's a union in place, the collective bargaining agreement might say any type of mandatory vaccinations, like a flu virus vaccine, have to be negotiated by your union reps. And so those are the only three wiggle rooms or exceptions to get out of taking that mandatory vaccine. And it's important to note that if an employer says, you know what, I see that this employee has a religious exemption, but I still don't want to grant it because it would be an undue hardship to me. So there is an exception for employers, even with those two exemptions, to say if they can establish in court it would be an undue hardship on their business to do so, then the court will allow them to refuse those two exemptions.
And one final point, what are some of the options employers can consider when creating vaccine policies within their own workplace?
Very quickly, they have three options. One, to make it voluntary, which is going to cause the least amount of ruckus. The second is a hybrid approach. You either get the vaccination or you have to continue to work remotely. Obviously, that's not going to work in all the business settings. And then lastly, to make it mandatory, again, with the possibility of employees using those two exemptions I mentioned earlier, which is going to be the religious exemption and the medical accommodation exemption.
All right, Dr. Laura, thank you so much for making us smarter once again. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Fred.
A Chicago politician is in hot water. He's being investigated after admitting his restaurant's been allowing diners to eat indoors despite a statewide ban. Eric Cox is live in Chicago, where critics are calling this a double standard. Good evening, Eric.
And good evening to you, Laverne. What is worse is that Illinois just saw its deadliest week of the pandemic yet. Nearly 1,000 people passing away because of COVID-19, and with thousands of other bars and restaurants all across the state shut down for indoor dining, one Chicago politician is putting profits above public safety. Ann Sather Restaurant's been a fixture in Chicago since 1945. The restaurant, well known for their cinnamon rolls, now making headlines for another reason. Customers can order pickup or delivery, but as recently as Sunday, dining in was also an option, despite both a state and city-wide ban due to Illinois' surge in COVID cases. Shocking images shared online showing customers eating inside Ann Sather as recently as last week. A Wall Street Journal newspaper on one of the tables dated Thursday, December 3rd. The diner's owned by longtime Chicago alderman and city council member Tom Tunney. When outed about allowing indoor dining during the pandemic, Tunney released a statement saying, quote, "This was an error in judgment and won't happen again."
Well, I agree it was an error in judgment. I also will say that elected officials should be setting an example.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker calling Tunney's actions irresponsible and unfair for fellow restaurant owners struggling to survive months of restrictions.
I feel terrible for the law-abiding bar and restaurant owners, that there are others out there that are trying to take advantage of the public and get them sick.
With an investigation underway, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot also weighing in. Her office saying, quote, "Any business found in violation of these guidelines has been and will be held fully accountable. No exceptions." The city says Tunney's restaurant now faces a potential fine of over $10,000. Citations aside, state leaders believe the real price the diner pays will be public perception.
When we get past this pandemic, I think that the people who were not protecting us will be held accountable by the patrons who live in their area. Back to the monetary amount that Ann Sather Restaurant will have to pay. That won't be determined until an administrative hearing at a later date, which is yet to be set. But in the meantime, Alderman Tom Tunney is being roasted by both the public as well as his fellow restaurant owners, some of them even calling for him to step down from city council. Reporting live in Chicago, I'm Eric Cox, BNC.
All right, thanks very much, Eric. Well, coming up next, an emotional reaction coming from Michigan Representative Cynthia Johnson. What she's saying after Republican leaders of the Michigan House of Representatives removed her from her committee assignments after racist death threats were made against her. Stay with us. This is BNC Prime.